I do not undersow the crop. I don't have to undersow anything anymore because the living mulches do it on their own.
Yeah.
I have not reseeded in 7 years.
Yeah.
Anything.
Yeah.
Which
and
is
how
lovely.
much compost have you used in those 7 years?
Zero, none.
Zero
I'm
compost.
growing all my own fertilizer. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, that's so
because
important.
20 years ago, I would have said this is impossible. Impossible.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Lindley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture. You just heard from Helen Atthowe, a small-scale farmer and dedicated organic farming researcher whose new book, The Ecological Farm, a minimalist, no-till, no-spray, selective-weeding, grow-your-own-fertilizer system for organic agriculture. Her book will be released on June 22nd.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast, and I'm very pleased today to be talking with Helen Atthowe. And Helen, I think I met you 2 days ago, and I was really impressed. You were part of a panel here at Eco Farm on not no-till, but on low-till. And
to till or not to till.
To till or not to till. And it's actually, we have a symposium that's going to be about that in about 5 weeks. So maybe part of this will be in it. It's a very interesting conversation, and everyone's so confused.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into to till or not to till.
Well, actually, I grew up in Montana, but I went to graduate school back east at Rutgers University and got to work a little bit with farmers in the east and knew some of you New Englanders. I spent some time in Vermont at Goddard College, the summer program for social ecology. But this was quite a long time ago, but it feels like old home week to talk to some New Englanders. But mainly I'm a Montanan. I grew up in Montana. After graduate school, I came back and got a job with Montana State University doing extension work. And because that wasn't enough, and you can't actually just talk about it, you have to do it, I also had a small 30-acre farm in Montana doing mainly vegetables and some fruit. And I was certified organic with our wonderful Doug Crabtree and the team that certifies in Montana. And I...
Place that for a minute. About what year did you go back to Montana? When did you start being a certified farmer in Montana?
Let's think of this. So I went back to Montana in the 90s, early 90s, and I was certified in the late 90s through the 2000s. And then I came to Eco Farm, and I was presenting, I think it was 2010, about living mulches, and there was a California orchardist who was presenting about living mulches, and we ended up getting married. And it was his farm or mine, and his was bigger, and California, and making more money. So I moved in with him, and we really got to experiment.
Yeah. You went to town.
We did.
So in Montana, you were growing vegetables?
Mainly vegetables. I did a lot of solanaceous crops, a lot of tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, because I felt it was really vital for me not to be competing with local farmers, since I was also supposed to be helping local farmers as an extension agent. So I tried to do things that were a little more difficult to do. And in New Jersey, I had learned to do staked tomatoes with some of the growers that were part of our integrated pest management program.
Yeah.
So I did that. And I had been lucky enough to travel when I was young and ended up learning from Masanobu Fukuoka. So I said, oh, how hard can this be? And people said, you can't do living mulches in Montana. You can't get rid of that much residue in a cold climate. And I said, I think I can. And that started the 30 years of trying to figure out how to minimize soil disturbance and manage surface applied residues.
Okay, so let's talk about living mulches. Is that why were you interested in living mulches?
Well, with now 30 years of hindsight, I have a different answer than if you would have asked me when I began. So I'm going to give you both answers. The most important one is one that I really have only come to the last 10 years, and doing research with my husband made it so clear, and that is the living root component. What is going on in that rhizosphere is so magical and so important to plant health and agriculture system health that I've become ridiculously nerdy about studying root exudates and the signals that come from those roots with the different biochemicals that are released at different times that signal different microorganisms to form root associations, and then that whole microbiome develops. But it can go one way or the other depending on root exudates. So organic matter that I used to focus on is so vital to the system, but organic carbon that comes as part of a root exudate is even more powerful because of everything else that's going on. So, living roots as the living mulch, as opposed to what we used to do, which is to cover the soil with dead mulches. And wonderful for so many ways, but a little different in the microbial community that develops under a dead mulch as opposed to a live mulch. And then the added complexity of a different diversity of root architecture and root exudates is going to have an even more complex microbial community.
So everything you say resonates for me, and it's things I've been thinking about a long time. But so the first question I'll ask as a farmer is, what's the difference between a living mulch and weeds? And I know that any weed can be a benefit, but we also know that farmers struggle by and large with weeds because it really compromises the crop that they're trying to sell.
Excellent question. So when I first started in the 90s, that was my mindset as well. Plus, being a nitrogen hoarder, I wanted to figure out how to get as much nitrogen in my system. So I had a not very diverse living mulch. And I had, Fukuoka had used clovers, so I began with clovers and tried to maintain a weed-free clover living mulch. Now I laugh because now my living mulches are just full of what we call forbs, other forbs, grasses and legumes, and I'm learning to manage that. But in the 90s, I definitely was just doing the clover, and I think that is the way to start. Don't start with a whole complex system. Complexity is messy. Don't start there. Try and simplify. So yes, I managed, I went from annual clover living mulches to then experimenting with perennial clover and other forb species, others might call them weeds, moving into the a perennial living mulch. And that was degrees more difficult as we went from annual to perennial. So I'm roundabout coming to your question is that I used to be much more concerned with how the sharing of roots in a particular space with other plants affected my crops. and I still am. It's part of my what I call managing ecological relationships rather than simply just managing crops. However, I'm learning that as I tweak the system and shift the balance towards my crops, but then allow other plants to move in as my crop plants have become dominant, I'm not quite so worried as I was 20 or 30 years ago. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, the real question is what happens. So you're finding ways to manage the living mulch that don't compete, but rather contribute to the crop that you're planning to harvest?
Yes, and so we probably don't have time to talk about all the intricacies of managing residues in a way that looks at carbon to nitrogen ratio and tries to get the optimum decomposition. And back to those living roots, I have very little science on this, but putting on my farmer hat, I really do think that in the spring, when I work on applying lower carbon, higher nitrogen residues to get that kick, I do think the root exudates are part of priming my mineralization process, my decomposition process. But I don't have any good evidence for that yet. I have a better evidence for all of the microbial interactions that are possible, but not what's actually happening.
So you're seeing benefits to the crop.
Right.
We know it makes complete sense to me that there are benefits to the soil, and that over time this is going to be a really wonderful thing. And the challenge is, we know the people with the highest organic matter are like dairy farmers who are managing pastures well. And yes, it's wonderful, it's no-till, and the cows are doing beautiful magic if you're really good at rotating the pasture and when the cow should be there. But this is different. This is saying, yeah, we're going to grow a crop, maybe in a row. I know Fukuoka didn't like to grow them in a row, but let's say that you've got a row of tomatoes, and you'd still see a living mulch could be a benefit to those tomatoes, to that tomato crop?
Absolutely. And actually, that's where I started in the 90s. With some training in entomology, I was very interested in beneficial insects, so predators and parasites, and maintaining habitat for them. So believe it or not, I started out with these living mulches mainly as habitat for beneficial insects and did quite a bit of on-farm experimentation that showed that in fact this undisturbed ground cover and source of sequential bloom all season greatly increased our parasites and our predators, both the ground dwellers, the carabid beetles and the robe beetles, and the syrphid flies and parasitic wasps and parasitic flies significantly. And then we designed what I think is a really elegant system to experiment, actually, to test the system. And we were able to show that we had a significant predation and increased yield over where we killed off the predators by spraying rotenone pyrethrin. And then we looked at BT as well. Anyway, an interesting experiment that showed that we were indeed getting a significant increase in predators and parasites by providing that habitat as close to the crop as possible, so that predators and parasites didn't have to move in from my hedgerows or from my insectaries, that they could live where they work. They didn't have to commute to work.
Would you, so I grow in a greenhouse, and they are indeed the regular entomologists who work on biocontrol in greenhouses are now advising to put in, some flowering alyssum. But they're talking about putting a pot of it or planting it at the end of the row. But you're imagining the whole plant row having alyssum, perhaps.
I just did an enormous literature review and compiled all of my own research over the last 30 years, mine and my husband's. and into a book, and there's a chapter on this topic of where the habitat does the best for the organisms that we're trying to encourage in a way that enhances pest suppression. And I'm going to just throw out a word, interspersed. Interspersed rather than blocked habitat seems to be the most effective in both abundance and diversity of your beneficial insects. So having that habitat interspersed with your crop. And how much of it needs to be habitat versus crop, I don't know. I go with about 30% habitat and the rest in crop. Which is actually a significant amount, if you think about it. I don't know if it needs to be that much, but I do think that the evidence for interspersed rather than blocked over here or over there is there.
Is much more effective.
Yeah.
And would you be planting? And we're getting off from what I want to go back to, but would you? I can't help myself. Would you be planting? So the alyssum might be great for Incarcia, but might not be the right thing for Persimilis.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So over the last 30 years, what I have moved towards is away from specialists and trying to encourage a diversity of generalists. I have now my pinup calendar of spiders, my spider for every month. I am so impressed with, and there's getting to be more and more evidence about how important generalists like spiders are within the system for actually causing pest suppression, and carabid beetles and syrphid flies, as opposed to some of these specialist wasps.
Yeah.
In fact, in our study, we were looking at cabbage worms on Brussels sprouts for 2 years, and we what was responsible for the pest suppression that we were able to monitor and to show was a guild of generalist predators starting early in the season and going late in the season, and different generalists were most prevalent at different times. And when we collected the cabbage worm larvae and reared them to see if they were, to see what parasites, we found hardly any parasites in our effective biocontrol system. Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
So I think that means that these systems where we are designing for great diversity of generalist predators who start early and finish late may be even more effective than where we bring in a specialist and there's lag time between when that parasite builds up its populations to manage the pest that has already reached a relatively high level before the parasite populations get to be high enough to manage it.
Well, we certainly hope not. We like to get those in very early, and regularly. But yes, these are other ways in which don't require so much management.
Well, don't, and because they are always there. And that's the other beauty of the living mulch system, by the way, is that you don't get predators and parasites remaining in your system if there's not a food source. So within the living mulch, we have an alternative food source.
Yeah.
So that they're always there in low numbers, and then they can build more easily than when we bring something in.
So one more question, and then we'll go back, because I really want to talk about the nitrogen dilemma. But, is it possible that living mulch could become a host plant for the pest as well?
Absolutely. And I told you I have 500 pages about this kind of thing in my book, but so I'm being very simplified here, but yes. So I like to think about systems and farming systems as evolving through stages. They're not static. And that in early stages, you might have to do a little more intervention. And when you get to what I'd like to think of as a dynamic equilibrium stage, you're doing less. And then you move back into stages where things are senescing and you have to do more intervention. So if you're in an early stage, your living mulch might encourage aphids, and that might be problematic to your crop as opposed to providing an alternative food source for predators. Eventually, it's going to do that. Yeah. But in the short term, you might encounter some issues.
Right.
Sometimes being an ecologist takes patience, it just turns out.
Yes, it's very complicated. I work with a few of the great entomologists of our continent, and they're often wrong, you know. And it's just because it's a very complicated. Oh, there's some influence that we didn't expect. So let's go back for a minute to living mulches and compost and nitrogen.
Yes.
So you're a nitrogen hoarder, or you're a reformed nitrogen hoarder.
I'm a reformed nitrogen hoarder. Let's
explain that for a minute.
Sure.
Organic growers in general are always a little paranoid about nitrogen because it's kind of hard to come up with in a natural system. I mean,
Yes.
Nature does not store nitrogen.
Yes.
It cycles it.
It's very volatile.
Yes, it's very volatile. It's always in transition. So because of that, organic growers can be a little nervous about that. So you were one of those people. You were a nitrogen hoarder.
I was, and I'm embarrassed to say, or pleased and embarrassed to say, that in the early years of my farm, I started in the early 1990s, and by the mid-1990s, with this system of applying compost every year, doing tillage in the spring, seeding my living mulch, making my beds, seeding my living mulches in between the crop rows, and then mowing them. And of course, I was mowing them to maintain weeds, right? I didn't want the weeds to
control.
And it worked beautifully for most weeds, but that's another story. What it was also doing was leaving surface applied residue on the surface regularly throughout the seasons. But in graduate school, I had been told that if you left surface applied residue, that you were going to lose it you were going to lose the nitrogen to denitrification, and that you weren't going to get much nitrogen unless you incorporated it. So I didn't even measure that in my calculations. I would do a soil test and I would say, okay, I'm going to get a little bit from incorporating, and then I'm going to make up the rest of my nitrogen needs for my crop with compost. Well, both with glee and embarrassment, I say that by the mid-90s, I would do my soil test every year in the spring, and I was looking at about 100 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. I said, holy heck, I'm as high as my neighbors that are using conventional fertilizers and polluting the groundwater. And then my potassium levels were almost unreadable. They were so high, 900 parts per million. Phosphorus levels were high as well. And I said, I may have to rethink this and understand what's going on in the system a little more. And about that time, I was also seeing increased blossom end rot and sun scald on pepper. And I thought about that, looking at the ratios of nitrogen to other nutrients. So long story short is I stopped applying compost. I slowed down and then eventually stopped in 2002. And I just want to say that you have to drive the tractor very fast to only apply 2 tons per acre of compost, just saying.
Before, how much compost on a year were you putting?
I was going from about 7 to 10 tons per acre.
Okay.
Which is, I was not abnormal at the time.
Yes.
I was not. But I had these living mulches. Not only was I adding residue, probably 4 mowings throughout the season, but it was the living roots as well, and it was the infield cycling and recycling of nutrients by having vegetation there. Because it steals nutrients, which is what we worry about, but it also holds nutrients.
Yes.
Yeah.
Amazing. So you were getting not only nitrogen, but seriously elevated potassium and phosphorus.
And I'm so glad you asked that. So with a study that I did then in the mid-90s is how do we manage this residue and what's it really contributing? We did these wonderful treatments where we compared mowing the living mulch monthly to lightly disturbing it, kind of like a power harrow, to actually tilling it and having bare soil in between the rows, which was horrifying after not doing that for many years.
Yes.
The soil was horrible by the end of the season, so compacted with bare soil alone. And before every treatment, every month, we would clip it and do a nutrient analysis. And I was intrigued and surprised by 2 things. Number one, how high the potassium was in my clover living mulch, and 3 things. And 2, how high some of the micronutrients were. And number 3, that my mowings in the early spring, as opposed to midsummer and late fall, nutrient levels differed and carbon to nitrogen ratios differed significantly. And this was a aha moment for me that, I can manage carbon to nitrogen ratios and perhaps nutrient levels a bit by timing my selective mowing. And I was mowing selectively by then because I needed to leave some habitat undisturbed to really entice my beneficial insects.
So how would you do that? Would you mow like one path but not the next?
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
So one path would become your banker path,
right,
while one became your fertility path.
Exactly.
And then you'd trade places when this one was blooming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have it exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Brilliant. So it went from being basically a banker plant system to becoming your fertility engine, your driver.
Why don't I have you? I want to rewrite the book and use that. That's exactly what it is. I like to say that I was using this system to multitask and stack ecological function, that my nutrient cycling was multitasking as habitat building as well. But yes, it became the driver, and we were driving slowly. We were not driving at a breakneck speed the way we were when I would add large amounts of compost and at the same time tilling in my living mulches from the previous year. So basically having a cover crop growing in the field, right?
Yes.
And then tilling that in with compost. My goodness, can you imagine how the microbes felt? They felt like we feel after a huge Thanksgiving dinner or a big cheese pizza, just a little sluggish.
So did you stop tilling in the living mulch? You let it become a permanent mulch?
Ultimately, in the mid-2000s, that is what I did. But it took me, for just the reasons you're mentioning, all those years to become brave enough to see what was going on in the system and say, you know what? I think we have enough ecological function, enough rapid mineralization. I think we can manage our system in a way that we can get optimum decomposition, that I can perennialize an annual system by putting in an annual living mulch. What did it take me? It took me almost 15 years to get there.
When you say an annual living mulch?
Well, so in the early years, I might be planting living mulches that were perennials, like a white clover, but I was tilling it in every spring, so I was only letting it grow for a season. So I was using it in my mind as an annual.
Yes.
Whereas when I did the perennial living mulches, I planted a whole bunch of, a big field, 6-acre field, to red clover. It came up so weed-free and beautiful you can't imagine. And I said, aha, we will leave that as our perennial living mulch, and we will just strip till where our crop rows will go.
Yes.
Yeah. Exactly.
Fantastic. And so it becomes a permanent bed system in essence.
It did. Yes, it did. And over the years now, I realized that as all agroecosystems evolve and change, that wasn't going to be static. That what it seems now with 20 years of hindsight is that I can get about 5 years out of that perennial bed system. And then what happens is just what ecologists have told us happens in old field ecology, for example, in England. You get cycles of regeneration between legumes and grasses. And so what happened is my red clover would change the soil such that the legume was less competitive, and the grasses that you had not seen at all, but were lurking there,
Yes.
began to predominate. And by the 6th or 7th year, the clover was almost gone. It was all grasses.
Wow.
And so then, of course, more intervention and then tillage and perhaps changing your bed system.
So you might reseed every 5 or 6 years, just redo the paths to bring back the clovers.
Right. And maybe you just seed your bed, right?
Yes.
And till in that living mulch so that you can still manage it so there's living roots. You don't have to go through the whole bloody field and
Yes.
till again. Maybe, and maybe you do. Maybe
Yeah.
your weeds have become, I now have, I've become such a carbon farmer that I have grasses and legumes as my living mulch. And I have stoloniferous, rhizomatous grasses that move into my beds by the end of the season. And for me, I think it's lovely because I do not have to seed any cover crops. I don't have to seed cover, winter cover, because my living mulches move in and then I strip till them in the spring. But if that got out of control, you might want to do more tillage.
And then till your paths again to start over.
Yeah.
Okay. But do you keep the beds fairly clean of other plants than your crop? Or do you undersow the crop as well?
I do not undersow the crop. I don't have to undersow anything anymore because the living mulches do it on their own.
Yeah.
I have not reseeded in 7 years.
Yeah.
Anything.
Yeah.
Which
And
is
how
lovely.
much compost have you used in those 7 years?
Zero, none.
Zero
I'm
compost.
growing all my own fertilizer. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, that's so
because
important.
20 years ago, I would have said this is impossible. Impossible.
So you're growing your fertility.
Yes.
You're not adding any other fertilizer.
When we put the orchard in, we added to each tree hole, along with the living mulch, and we brought in some hay mulch, about 50 pounds per tree. We added a mix my brilliant husband came up with of phosphorus, potassium, and micronutrients, but no nitrogen.
No nitrogen.
The orchard is 7 years, going on 8 years now, and has never had any nitrogen fertilizer than what we grow.
Yeah.
It's incredible to me.
It's
the vegetables have had in the high tunnel we add the micronutrients because that's so intensive.
Yes.
But in the vegetable field, we have, because we have cheaper land, we have 10 foot of row middle and only 5 foot of bed.
Yeah.
So we are leaving a lot of land to grow.
To grow your fertility.
Right. So I need to make that very clear that we are utilizing land to grow the fertility within the field because it's multitasking as habitat as well as nutrient cycling. And we get so much mulch that I'm coming to your question in a roundabout way. I'll get the crop in. I might do a wheel hoeing early on, and then I take the living mulch on either side and I let it get about 8 inches tall, and then I mow it in, and it's a weed mulch.
So I know we have to go soon, but tell me about mowing and frequency. Are we okay?
We're good. We've got about 5 minutes.
Yeah, good. Tell me about mowing and frequency, because you were saying some very interesting things yesterday about the actual nutrient content is quite different based on when you mow.
Exactly. So now that we have these large row middles, which is clearly not for everyone, 10-foot row middles are a little ridiculous. But it's part of an experiment that we started 5 years ago, and so there you have it. So I can, with a much smaller mower and much less impact on my soil, I can get right close to the crop. And I can mow really tight, and I can blow that residue into the surface, and I can leave the centers unmowed. So I can have tall 3 or 4 foot habitat, and then right next to my crop, I can suppress the living mulch by mowing several times throughout the season, and particularly in the first third of that crop's life cycle, when we're trying to shift the balance away from the living mulch towards the crop. Then I mow it really short. It looks right next to the, for about a 2-foot area. I use just a Husqvarna lawnmower. It's hysterical. My neighbors find it hysterical. And I mow it like a golf course right close to the crop.
Yes.
And then mow the residue in. So I'm providing habitat for spiders and ground-dwelling beetles. I'm suppressing annual weeds a little bit. And I'm providing regular application of organic residues, as we would see in a natural system, for regular nutrient cycling, as opposed to point-in-time nutrient application where you add a whole bunch at once. I'm adding smaller amounts over the season. And I think that that's really vital. I have a little bit of experimentation to validate that, but not enough.
Yeah.
It turns out it's hard for me to do all the experimentation and farm too.
Yeah, of course. You do an amazing amount of experimentation. Elliot just sent me a piece that Wendell Berry wrote about Louis Bromfield this morning. I think he wrote it a while back. And I read Louis Bromfield when I was a young man and was very inspired. My father read Louis Bromfield when he became a dairy farmer, and he was very inspired. And I don't think it worked as well for my father as it did for Louis Bromfield. But that whole idea of what height you're mowing.
Oh yes. I'm a total believer in that. And I'm getting to be an old lady. I don't know how much more I will be able to do, but I have so much more to learn.
Yes, yes. All right, I don't want you to be late. So before we close, I just want to say the Ecological Farm is coming out by Helen Atthowe, forward by Paul Muller. When's that coming out?
June. It'll be out June of this year.
Wonderful. I can hardly wait to read it. It sounds great.
It's a little intense and packed.
So am I.
Well, you will have no problem with it. I worry a little bit for some people, but the editors have done such a good job of making me be clear, and they did. I did have 500 citations. They got it down to 200 so that it's not scientifically nerdy, and they encourage me to have lots and lots of practical farm stories.
Wonderful. I'm seriously been hunting for this for years, so seriously.
Oh, you're making me blush.
Yeah. So thank you, Helen Atthowe, very much for taking this time this morning.
Thank you for all the incredible work you're doing. As the world goes one way, you are trying to pull it back the way I think is the right way.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. We hope that you'll subscribe and share a link with your friends. Please take the time today to leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to so that others can find us. A video version of this interview is found at realorganicproject.org and by following our YouTube channel. Please join us next time when our guest will be Miguel Altieri, professor of agroecology at UC Berkeley and a PhD entomologist with deep knowledge of the biological controls that can be used to control pests in place of chemicals. If you'd like to dig in further to the subject matter we've been exploring this year about the rise of USDA support for chemical no-till agriculture and its affiliation with regenerative and climate smart in the marketplace, you can find tickets to the recordings of our recent symposia at realorganicsymposium.org.